On October 15, 1954, the most famous hurricane in Canadian history struck southern Ontario. Hurricane Hazel pounded Toronto region with winds that reached 68 miles per hour and dumped over 11 inches of rain in 48 hours. Now, Charlie's going to start this one off.
Yeah, start this one off. That's what I'm going to do is kind of start at the beginning. It was 10 days before Hazel arrived in the Toronto area. It started in the West Indies off Grenada, northward through Venezuela, Haiti, where it did a huge amount of damage. 1,000 people died. Crops were, the coffee and cocoa crops were decimated. Northward onto the Carolina coast of the Carolina coast on the eastern shore of America there. 240-kilometer winds, 12-foot surges. Can you imagine 12 feet of water coming at you? Out of 275 homes on that shoreline, only were 2 left standing. Northward into suburbs of Washington, D.C., Pennsylvania, the Allegheny Mountains, which is a mountain range in Pennsylvania. They thought that Hazel had subsided, but low weather pattern, she triggered it was underway again. And in New York State, $1.5 billion damage. 100 people were killed in the eastern USA. Onward to Lake Ontario. The weather services at that time were unprepared for this type of an event, which had never happened before. Previous to it had been already raining for a week. By the time on the 15th of October, when it arrived in Toronto in the late afternoon, in 48 hours there was a foot of water had fallen. The Humber River street, one of the streets near the Humber River, 30 people died on one street alone. Five firemen in an escape attempt. Woodbridge, Thistletown area, 9 people died, 12 families homeless, 40 bridges, trains off tracks, you name it. And closer to home, the marsh, Holland Marsh, suffered, depending on where the water was, some water coming from the Lake Simcoe end, some water coming from the west end of the Holland River and the Shumpert Creek. Up to 30 feet of water covered the marsh. I can remember a couple of days after that, driving down 400 from the north over the top of the hill, looking down on the marsh. It didn't look like you were looking out over Lake Ontario. And it was late October, of course. Harvest was mostly completed. Vegetables either in crates or in windrows on the ground. All those crops were lost. 1,000 people were displaced from the marsh area. There was a camp set up on Simcoe Street in Bradford where 1,000 people were and there was one, well, you can imagine the destruction, houses floating across the marsh with people on the roof or in the attic. The Deputer family had just moved from Holland in the spring of that year, and they were a family of mom, dad, and 12 children. They were housed in a house near Springdale, and they were working on the farm. As the water started to rise, was coming in out of the main floor. They started piling furniture and stuff on the tables and so on. And then they went upstairs. Looking out a window, they were looking at the house next door. Thought that house was moving. And then they realized it's our house that's moving. So for 2 miles, that house drifted in the current of the Holland River until it came to rest on the bank of 400 Highway. And they were eventually rescued by boat. That was just, and still closer to home, in all this part of Ontario, 81 people died. 5 of those people lost their lives on our farm in the valley. Penville Creek runs through our farm, and on a personal note, an event that had a lot happier ending. A car that was, the 5 that were died had approached, were coming from the west, and were washed off the road, and the vehicles and the bodies were found up against fences in our farm. A car that was approaching from the east, 2 young couples were headed for a dance and beaten. Their car was washed off the road on our side of the bridge and got caught in a tree. The 2 men found their way to our house seeking help, and the girls were hanging on their limbs in the tree. Well, my dad and another helper or 2 took a long rope out of our barn, went down to that, put a rope around my waist, and I went out through the water from limb to limb. And one girl at a time went in my arm back to shore, back to high ground. And the 4 of them spent the night in our house, drying out. I guess later that night or the next day, the approaches to the bridge were washed out, and I don't remember any details from then on, except that our valley the road was raised considerably, and there was a new bridge constructed there. So that's kind of, as far as the marsh is concerned, the vegetables, crates and onions and carrots and so on floating, and when the big pumps were involved in pumping the water off the marsh, then they were having an awful time with the intakes to the pumps were constantly being clogged with floating vegetables, so that was just one of the side effects of the. That's all I have to say about the.
Thanks, Charlie, for sharing that story. Thank you. Doug, you got something to add?
Well, I certainly remember Hurricane Hazel because we were living on our farm, and it was in a flood zone, and I think we had over 50 head of cattle drowned down on our pasture, which was 2 lots to the west of our home farm. And I think a lot of you people will remember Hurricane Hazel, and I think it was 65 years ago last week. That was sort of an anniversary of Hurricane Hazel, and I called a neighbor of ours up, John Kirby, who lives down in Chatham now, and I asked him, do you remember what you were doing 65 years ago today, John, he says, oh no, what was going on? And I said, well, that was Hurricane Hazel. And so that sort of revived his memory. But it was a real tragedy, I guess, because it did a lot of damage, and there were acres and acres flooded, and Charlie referred to the Holland Marsh, and I think you people have all heard that story about how a house went right across 400 Highway, stopped in 400 Highway. So it was, I hope we never had, they called it a 100-year storm, but I think it was one of the worst storms that I think Ontario ever experienced, and probably, I hope we never have another one like it. However, that's about, all those cattle I could mention, there were more than our cattle drowned. Harvey's Don Harvey, and you probably, a lot of people know him. He lost quite a few, and Rivets lost a lot, and Barkos lost some. They were pulled out onto the 11th line, and at that time, it was a Gordon Young dead stock removal, and they brought trucks up and loaded them, and the way they went, I guess, to Toronto, as far as I know. However, we don't want to experience that again, and I still have memories of what went on then. Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Doug.